Good morning, Ashanti.
Morning, how are you? Hi
Uh,
everyone, lovely to be here.
Good to have you with us. So, I mean, today we really want to breach the subject and really embrace the conversation. It's something that has
So,
become very prevalent, particularly over the last 12 months with the Black Lives Matter movement,
mm,
things like this. So, firstly, we want to talk about small businesses and what
yes.
does diversity and inclusion mean for small businesses?
Essentially, what it means is just using your resources and influence in a that is in terms of who you recruit, how you recruit, and also your supply chain. Because for many small businesses, you may not be in a position to recruit. Let's face it, maybe you have a small team or you're a one-man band, which is also fine. But there are other practical ways that you can tap into being a more diverse and inclusive business, for example, by having more diversity in maybe your social media marketing in terms of the visuals that you use, thereby showing potential customers that you welcome different types of customers. And of course, with our supply chains, as a small business myself, I get to choose to a great extent who I work with. So I look for companies that have great values around sustainability and also, yes, in terms of diversity and inclusion. So those are some practical things that a small business can do to work on diversity and inclusion.
Yeah, so I think a lot of people may think it just applies to the big corporates
Yeah.
and things like that, the bigger businesses, but small businesses and SMEs have a big role to play. And you talk about the practical ways and the different
Mm.
areas in a business. So your marketing, your supply chain, what other areas in a business can diversity and inclusion really be implemented?
Yeah, absolutely. So if you do have, for example, a team, and it's really about thinking about what processes and systems that you have in place that could disadvantage certain groups of your employees. And honestly, it's really interesting when you look into it. You've got mature employees, you might have younger employees who are new to the workforce, you may also have disabled employees. You may have employees that have hidden disabilities and conditions. Neurodiversity at the moment is a big conversation that's happening, in addition to pronouns. So individuals now are able to let you know how they would like to be referred to. So even for small businesses where you've got 2 or 3 people in the team, the language that we use can create more diversity and inclusion, more importantly, make people feel valued and welcomed within your business on a day-to-day basis.
Yeah, and specifically in a networking case, you've got to be aware of that going
Yes.
into a room and how people need to be
Yes.
addressed and things like that. And it's just the awareness piece around that. So when it comes to a diversity and inclusion policy within a business, whether you're recruiting and you're onboarding staff, or you're recruiting new clients, or you're recruiting suppliers, should there be some sort of policy in place, and how would you advise smaller companies going about including that?
Absolutely. Look, we're always very pragmatic with small businesses. So the reality is you're not going to have a 60-page document on an intranet the way a large corporation or FTSE 100 company might. But what it is important to do is at least think about internally, if you have more than one person involved in things like recruitment, for example, think about ensuring that the language in your job description doesn't alienate a certain gender or, again, persons with disabilities. Think about where you actually advertise. And I know it's quite tough as a small business. We tend to hire people we know, right? They come through referral and recommendation. And so sometimes thinking about where we're advertising our job roles is a very practical thing a small business can do. And so what happens is you find you do have a way of doing things, even if you don't have a full kind of employee handbook or policy on diversity and inclusion. You start developing a way of approaching your colleagues, a way of recruiting new colleagues, and you've probably got that written down somewhere on a document somewhere, shared in a shared folder. And so that's what you can do, practically speaking, as a small business. And this is obviously beyond the employment laws, for example, we're all subject to if we are employing individuals.
Yeah, and Richard Hodson's asked the question in the Q&A, actually. He said, hi, Ashanti, should diversity and inclusion be a part of a bigger ethics policy, such as environmental impact and sustainability?
Oh, that's a really good question, Richard, and absolutely it can be. And actually, what people don't realize quite often, a lot of work that has gone into things like sustainability and environmental policies. It's the same principles, except we're just applying it to human beings, essentially. And so quite often businesses do have an awareness of this. They do have some processes in place for how they approach sustainability, waste, recycling. It's written on a checklist, as it were. And so you can do a similar thing and use those same principles to approach diversity and inclusion. And the important thing to realize is that diversity and inclusion isn't the same for every business at all. You know, you might be a business that is, you know, all employees are able-bodied, for example. And so one of the things you can think about is, okay, are there, especially in this remote world, is there a role or a contract piece of work that we're hiring for, but an individual who may be at home because of a disability, for example, could actually do? And you might get a great person with great competencies, but they might be wheelchair bound, for example. But are we reaching out and inviting more, you know, diversity into our business in those ways?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, from our experience with a virtual event, it makes it a hell of a lot more inclusive, doesn't it? It's, you know, we're meeting people now that wouldn't necessarily have been able to attend live events for whatever reason or circumstance. So it's made our offering a lot more inclusive in that respect. And when you are advising companies, what is the typical response to this? What is the resistance that you typically face when you're approaching smaller companies?
You know, it's really interesting that you use the word resistance. I think a lot of the time it's just the unknown. What does diversity and inclusion really mean? And I will say that unfortunately, an unfortunate probably consequence of Black Lives Matter being in the mainstream press in the way it was, is that there's this assumption that it is really about race. And it's not. As I said, there's so many ways we can include different people in our world so that they can contribute to our business. But also maybe it's about who we serve as well. You know, one thing to be really aware of is young people. You know, they're out of work massively throughout this pandemic. And so are we embracing them in terms of the businesses that we run? That's a part of diversity and inclusion. So in answer to your question, the first piece is really the unknown. The second piece is, you know, the presumption that it is about race when we talk about diversity and inclusion. For some businesses it is. You know, if you're a FTSE 100 company and you have 0 people of color in your business, then yes, of course, it is a conversation that will be had at this time. And I think the third piece of resistance is the fear of being scrutinized publicly as well. You know, lots of business leaders they have to lead. And so to say, actually, I don't know about this, I didn't think about this before, I wasn't sure about this before, it's quite hard, you know, for people to do. And so I'd say the next one is about fear of public opinion and being, you know, talked about on social media as well. And then the last one is, you know, anxiety around actually asking your employees, how do you feel about working here? What do you like about working here? What could we do? Quite often, you know if we ask the question, we have to prepare ourselves for the possible answers that come along.
Yeah, I'll just pick out Ash Taylor's question in the Q&A. And Jeremy, thanks for yours. We'll come to that after, because it does touch on that. And Ash asked, is there a fear of legislation, paperwork, resource amongst smaller businesses in delivering something on policies, where it's maybe easier to say, I don't know how, rather than actually doing it?
Doing it. Absolutely. A really good question, Ash. Probably as well, there is an assumption that it's going to be an uphill mountain to climb. I mean, that's one of the reasons why we've worked with small businesses. As I say, it could be a one-page document that you have that is attached, for example, to employee contracts, so that they're aware of where you're trying to get to, and something that is in a shared folder, regardless of that. If you use Outlook, Google Drive, you can have it somewhere that everybody can access, and they know, look, these are the values that we're aiming for, and this is how we use those values or refer to them when we're hiring, when we're choosing who to buy services in from, etc.
Yeah, and I will come to Jeremy's question, because this is the concept of unconscious bias is through, I mean, admittedly, last year it really opened my eyes, and reading the book White Fragility, which I would recommend to anyone, really made me aware of, you know, how naive I was, and how privileged I am as a white male coming into this world. So Jeremy asks, how can you discuss how
unconscious bias? Yeah.
And what is it?
You know, it's really, absolutely. So this is a really interesting concept that, you know, has been around for some years, and depending on the size of the company and the industry, has helped them move forward, and sometimes not so much. So the idea behind unconscious bias is that we all have implicit biases within us that we're not aware of, that go unaddressed, but do influence and impact the way we see other people, and therefore the way we treat other people, essentially. So you might not be aware, for example, that for an individual from a certain cultural background or religious background, that alcohol is not something that they would partake of. And maybe in our workplace, all of our extracurricular activities involve or are centered around alcohol. So inherently what happens is we have excluded individuals or a group from socializing with us, and therefore maybe accessing promotional opportunities, because we all know that sometimes those conversations happen at the bar. So that is an example of unconscious bias. We just might not be aware of that, and then the resulting impact is that maybe somebody isn't able to really get involved in those activities. Now, in terms of unconscious bias, here's the thing, it really is about these events like these. You know, you even tabling this at one of your networking events is a way of learning about unconscious bias. It's a way of starting to think, okay, what thoughts or ideas, perceptions of people do I have that might be wrong, essentially? And then how does that impact the way I treat them? Maybe, you know, one of the things, for example, is, you know, disability. There's lots of individuals in businesses, hiring managers, who assume that because somebody is wheelchair bound, they cannot work. That's an implicit bias. That's an unconscious bias that when they come into the interview room, you think, well, they're not going to be able to, they're not going to turn up on time. They're always going to be sick and unwell. We're going to have to give lots of extra help to this individual. That is a bias that we have internally that we just haven't addressed and explored. And then what happens is we are not shortlisting that candidate for the role.
Yeah.
So that's really a good example, working example of unconscious bias. The way to start overcoming that is, if you are in a hiring position, think about the language used in your job descriptions, think about where you advertise your jobs, and think about you know, giving everyone a fair chance when they do turn up for interview as well.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, I've got one more question, but Mo Kanjilao has asked in the chat, what do you think are the common pitfalls people fall into when they're trying to recruit different types of people?
I think one of the common ones we see, ironically, is just not actually approaching people who are different. You know, quite a few of our clients, they will ask us about recruitment, and we will ask, so where have you been advertising? And they haven't advertised anywhere different to where they usually advertise. You know, a quick tip for this is, you know, for example, if you are looking for mature workers, for example, find networks, platforms, meetup groups that are full of mature workers. Approach those who run the community, who lead the community, who take care of that community transparently, and say, hey, you know, we're currently trying to recruit more mature persons into our workforce. We'd love to build a genuine rapport with yourself and be able to share these opportunities with your community and open up the conversation in that way. So one of the biggest pitfalls is not actually approaching these different groups and letting them know that you are actively trying to welcome them in and that you'd like to build a relationship with them.
Yeah, absolutely. And lastly, from me, the question would be maybe two-part question. In terms of small businesses getting started or finding that advice and guidance, where would they start? And also any recommendations of, you know, resources or videos or blogs or newsletters, something like that people can get started.
Yeah, I mean, the main thing to get started, I would say, is start with we produced a completely free guide where we've identified 5 main areas within a business that you can start to look at diversity and inclusion. And of course, hiring and recruitment is one of them, company culture is another, the supply chain is another. And so that guide will take you through. I know I've shared that with yourselves and it will probably go out by email later, but it's a completely free guide that guides you as to where to start first. And the other thing is just to, start a conversation within your business. It doesn't require you to post on social media. It doesn't require you to start maybe, talking to other people openly. And because there's a lot of risk associated with this conversation for all involved. To actually say, I don't know the answer, I'm not sure, is difficult. And so start with having internal conversations. Find out where your colleagues, your team are at on this topic. Ask them what they'd like to see changed within the company first, and then use the guide as a starting point to those conversations.
Yeah, I think
I did notice here, sorry to interrupt you, buddy. Terry was asking about age as an unconscious bias. We talked about it. Sometimes we make assumptions about older people, and we certainly make assumptions about younger people as well. So yeah, you can have unconscious bias about nearly anything, to be fair.
Yeah, that's good sort of idea of the different types of groups of people. It's not just race, I think, which a lot of people assume it is. But sorry for missing that one, Terry. I was busy monitoring the Q&A area. That's great. Well, Ashanti, look, we will share that document with everyone after today. It's been, it is just the starting point of this conversation. And I think people being open to embracing that change and embracing that diversity and inclusion in the workplace is the starting point. And SMEs and small businesses have a huge role to play in that. So appreciate your time joining us today. If you are able to stay in the room, I'm sure there will be some people with some questions that would love to further the conversation. So for the time being, thanks, Ashanti, and we'll speak to you soon. Thank you.
Take care. Bye-bye.
Thank you.